The best parts of Irenaeus' Against Heresies come in Book 3. In this book, Irenaeus explicitly explains his own epistemology in great detail. In this passage, in correcting heretics, Irenaeus starts with Scripture, which seems reasonable, since one would assume those professing to be Christians would accept the proper Scriptures and their proper interpretations. But Irenaeus is dealing with a wide variety of heretics, Gnostics mostly, some of whom apparently reject Scripture as incorrect or not of authority, either in part or as a whole, saying no truth was delivered in written documents, but only by tradition and word of mouth. Now, some Protestants eagerly jump on this, saying, see, those heretics were just like Catholics, appealing to tradition and word of mouth. But Irenaeus says Scripture is the ground and pillar of our faith. But this is a misreading of Irenaeus and an ignorance or rejection of the full context of what he says next. First of all, the Latin text and grammar of this passage is more precise than the English translation, and it shows us that the ground and pillar of the faith is the gospel, which Irenaeus tells us has come down to us both by public proclamation and by Scripture, not just Scripture alone. Futurum is singular and neuter in gender, rather than plural. And so this fits the singular and neuter evangelium, or gospel, rather than the plural and feminine scriptures. Again, Irenaeus is saying the gospel, both oral and written, is the ground and pillar of our faith, not just the scriptures. It should also be pointed out that expressions like has come down to us and handed down to us, these are themselves expressions of tradition. And so Irenaeus refers to Scripture itself as a tradition handed down in the church. Next, and obviously, it should be pointed out that, unlike these heretics that Irenaeus mentions, Catholics do not claim that the truth was not delivered by means of written documents. Catholics affirm the truth of Scripture. Catholics do not claim that truth was handed down only by word of mouth or only by tradition. So this is a wildly invalid comparison for Protestants to make. Lastly, as we've already seen previously and can see here, some of the heretics do in fact accept Scripture, but take advantage of ambiguous passages and claim that one needs to know a certain tradition in order to extract truth from the Scriptures. Now, how does Irenaeus respond to this claim? Does he reject and condemn the idea of tradition as necessary to properly understand Scripture? Not at all. Just the opposite. For both those heretics who say there are no inspired Scriptures but only tradition, and those heretics who do embrace Scripture but appeal to tradition, Irenaeus has the same answer, which is to, quote, refer them to that tradition which originates from the apostles and which is preserved by means of the succession of presbyters in the churches. In fact, Irenaeus is one of the most frequent and most powerful and most early witnesses to the authority of apostolic tradition as distinct from Scripture. Many Protestants will try to claim that what Irenaeus means by tradition is merely Scripture, or merely the exact same doctrinal content as one finds in Scripture. But clearly, this passage and the next one we'll look at debunk this Protestant claim. Here, Irenaeus accepts the distinction between the Scriptures themselves and the tradition necessary to extract truth from the Scriptures, namely their proper interpretation. So clearly, Irenaeus does not see Scripture and tradition as coextensive, or completely the same in content. Notice also that he says that apostolic tradition is preserved by church leadership succession, not by Scripture. And this preservation indicates a permanency that he will make explicit in another later passage we'll see. By the end of this passage, Irenaeus implicitly but clearly asserts tradition has at least equal authority in comparison to Scripture. He says the heretics consent neither to Scripture or to tradition, without any distinction of authority between the two. How Irenaeus sees the exact relationship between Scripture and tradition will become even more explicit and clear in the next passage we'll examine. Irenaeus tells us that truth is easy to obtain from the church. Not easy to obtain from Scripture, but from the church. In fact, he brings up the hypothetical scenario of the apostles not leaving the church any writings. He sees this scenario as entirely plausible, as something that could have happened. And does he freak out at the thought of having no New Testament scriptures? Not at all. He says in such a scenario that Christians could just follow the tradition handed down to those whom the apostles committed the churches to. Now, some Protestants try to argue Irenaeus is just engaging in a thought experiment, that the church and apostolic tradition are what we'd have to rely on in the absence of New Testament scripture. But since we do have New Testament scripture, we don't have to rely on the church and apostolic tradition, but rather we rely on scripture alone. But that's not what Irenaeus actually says. Before even bringing up the hypothetical scenario of no New Testament scripture, he says if a divisive dispute arises among Christians, presumably including about scripture and its interpretation, and its canon, I might add. If such a decisive dispute arises among Christians, we can learn from the most ancient churches what is certain and clear, even when we do have New Testament scripture available to us. This is not sola scriptura, where scripture is sufficient, but rather an epistemology where the church and its apostolic tradition is sufficient, with or without scripture. That this is Irenaeus' point becomes even clearer when he goes on to talk about barbarians who become Christian without the benefit of any scripture because of apostolic tradition and the church. This whole passage is a huge patristic death blow to sola scriptura in Protestant epistemology. And notice that Irenaeus asserts that the ancient tradition of the church and the apostles can and is preserved throughout time, even without writings. Irenaeus ends this section saying, thus, by means of that ancient tradition of the apostles, they, meaning the barbarians, do not suffer their minds to conceive anything of the doctrines suggested by the portentous language of these heretical teachers, among whom neither church nor doctrine has ever been established.